Hello, I'm Kevin Anderson. I'm the intern pastor here at Love of Christ Lutheran Church. Along with Pastor Steve Talmadge and Pastor Nanette Christofferson, we offer these brief studies into the text for the upcoming Sunday. And the text for this Sunday, the second Sunday after Pentecost, comes from the 65th chapter of Isaiah. We're looking at the first 9 verses. Just a brief background and context, some of which will be a reminder for you all. Isaiah lived in Jerusalem, and Isaiah is a major prophet, and he's a major prophet not because the content of what is in the book of Isaiah, but purely in the length. It is a long book. There are 66 chapters in Isaiah, and one of the things that makes Isaiah kind of unique is that what he said was going to happen happened, and it began to happen in his lifetime. So Isaiah is usually cut up into 3 parts. You have first Isaiah, second Isaiah, and third Isaiah. So it is an expanse of time. And there's more that we've talked about with that. But our text for this week from the 65th chapter is considered third Isaiah. It is a time after exile. The Israelites have been invited to return to their city after Babylonian exile, and they're going to go back to Jerusalem. They're going to rebuild the temple. Now, chapter 65 falls in the midst of kind of a conversation towards the end of the book. And it's a conversation between God and God's people, and some have described it as kind of like a form of therapy, where we get to see God's people articulating truths about what they've seen or what they've noticed about God, and then you hear God responding with God's truth to that. So it's this kind of conversation where things are brought forth that have been noticed, that have been said, that have been done, and there's kind of an overall reflection of everything that has happened. So in chapter 63, we hear a remembrance of God's action in exile, that God brought forth Israel being put into exile because of their actions. And I forgot to point this out. The theme in Isaiah you're going to hear is judgment and hope. So the judgment sends Israel into exile because they have been unfaithful to God. They've broken the covenant. There's worship of idols. There's mixing of culture. There's all kinds of things that Israel is doing to live outside of the covenant that God has made with them. Rebellion is articulated in the 63rd chapter of Isaiah, and then there's a remembrance, a deep story of God's saving action that is all the way back to Moses. Now, these stories that we have in the Old Testament are central to Israel's story and understanding of who they are and how God is in relationship to them. In the story of Moses, this is how God's people were freed out of slavery. They received the commandments through Moses. There's all of that. And so there's kind of just this line in chapter 63 that we're remembering what God has done all the way back to Moses in the origin of God's saving act with God's people. In chapter 64, there's a longing for God to come back and restore what was. That would be the temple, to restore God's relationship with Israel. And there's a line in here. I invite you to read chapter 63, 64, and 65. It kind of helps. Even to 66, just finish it on out. It kind of helps frame what we're going to read in a little better context. There's this line in here in chapter 64. Do not be exceedingly angry, O Lord, and do not remember iniquity forever. So there's this longing to be restored, to be brought back into a relationship with God, because although Israel in this context is post-exile, they are returned to Jerusalem, it is not going how they hoped that it would go. So there's some unmet expectations for some of Israel, and that's part of the central piece of this dialogue that is happening, is that we thought things were going to be a certain way, and they're not. And we'll see God's response as to why things are not the way that they are. But 65 there's this continued conversation, and there's this interesting commentary I read by Corey Driver, and just briefly, it kind of sets up our text, and it's this. Why don't you, Israel is saying to God, why don't you save us and take care of us like you used to? Sure, we sinned against you some, but your neglect is the real problem. So again, you can kind of see that's the tone of the conversation of Israel towards God. And then we get into our text where God responds. Let's read. I was ready to be sought out by those who did not ask, to be found by those who did not seek me. I said, here I am, to a nation that did not call on my name. I held out my hands all day long to a rebellious people, who walk in a way that is not good, following their own devices. A people who provoke me to my face continually, sacrificing in gardens and offering incense on bricks, who sit inside tombs and spend the night in secret places, who eat the flesh of pigs with broth of abominable things in their vessels, who say, keep to yourself, do not come near me, for I am too holy for you. These are a smoke in my nostril, a fire that burns all day long. See, it is written before me, I will not keep silent, but I will repay. I will indeed repay into their laps their iniquities and their ancestors' iniquities together, says the Lord, because they offered incense on the mountains and reviled me on the hills. I will measure into their laps full payment for their actions. Thus says the Lord, as the wine is found in the cluster, and they say, do not destroy it, for there is a blessing in it, so I will do for my servants' sake and not destroy them all. I will bring forth descendants from Jacob and from Judah, inheritors of my mountains. My chosen shall inherit it, and my servants shall settle there. There's a lot going on. We get kind of these descriptions of God's view of the relationship, right? And it's not great for Israel. Israel kind of says, why can't you go back to loving us the way that you used to love us? And God's response is, well, you're not keeping the covenant. And so we'll kind of break this down verse by verse, just briefly here. God says in verse 1, I was ready to be sought by those who did not ask, to be found by those who did not seek me. God is present in these unexpected ways for Israel, and it's not, it causes problems for Israel because they have these hopes of what God is going to do, and God does something different, and they're left scratching their heads and kind of asking these questions. And even in spite of Israel's action, as it says in verse 2 there, I held out my hands all day long to a rebellious people who walk in a way that is not good, following their own devices. So God continues to reach out, even when the people did not deserve it. This is a sign of God's graceful response to Israel, who is not keeping the covenant, and yet God still continues to reach out. And then we have these stories of idolatrous rituals. It's a way of showing spiritual elitism, is one way it's been described. And so I'll just go through a few of these lines that were brought up in there. Sacrifice in the gardens. That's one of the things God brings forward. That is a place where pagan sacrifices took place. And according to the law written in the book of Moses in the Old Testament, sacrifices are to be done at the altar in Jerusalem. So sacrificing in gardens is not living into the covenant. Offerings on bricks, we heard that language. That's a foreign ritual method. Israelite altars are to be made of unhewn stone. You can find that in Exodus chapter 20. So even though they are performing offerings, they are offering them in impure ways that they know that they should not. So again, God is bringing forth the ways that Israel is not living into their covenant. Sitting in tombs, trying to communicate with the dead, that's breaking God's commandments. You can find that in Deuteronomy chapter 18, where God tells God's people not to make inquiries of the dead. And then obviously there's a violation of dietary restrictions that is present here as well. And we'll keep going. In verses 6 and 7, there are consequences to the disposition of our hearts, sin, and the actions we take out of that disposition. Right? So God is going to not allow things that are not God's way to continue on forever. So there's judgment. It uses the language repayment in here. And that's because the God that we have is a just God. And the ways in which Israel's heart, like ours, is turned in on itself, the way that we do not live into what God has set up for us, there are consequences to that. But then in verse 8, we hear this hope. So again, the first kind of 7 verses, we hear this kind of, this is what's going on, this is what's wrong, and there's a judgment that comes with that. And then in 8, we hear this hope, that God's servant will not be destroyed. God's servant there is Israel. That's what it's told to us in Isaiah. That this servant is not going to be destroyed. And there's a reminder in verse 9 of God's covenant, God's living into the covenant. Although Israel has acted and continues to act outside of God's covenant, there is a promise of inheritance, of being restored, of being brought fully back into relationship with God. Now, overall, I would say the text that we have shows that Israel cannot be in right relationship with God by their own power. They've endured so much in the book of Isaiah. They have gone through exile. They have been totally destroyed. The temple destroyed. Everything that they've held sacred and dear has been burned and taken over by outside forces. And then that is relieved. And all of that for Isaiah is framed to this understanding of this is the judgment that Israel receives for not living into a covenant that they've made with God. And so it's becoming clear that Israel cannot do this on their own. They cannot be in a right relationship, with God on their own. They continually fail. They continually need help. So we hear, for us as Christians, we know where this help is going to come from. Israel is like us. Israel is in the same condition that we are. Our hearts are turned in on ourselves. We cannot even keep the covenants that we make with God. No matter how hard we try, we will fail. The disposition of our hearts will be brought forth. And yet in Isaiah we hear this hopeful proclamation that God's servant will not be destroyed, that God promises to give us an inheritance, that God will be with us, that God will restore us. And for us as Christians, we know this happens in the person of Jesus, that this is the means by which we are brought into a right relationship with God, is through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, blessings to you as we prepare for worship and as you take a closer look at the text for this coming week.